For 55 years, one name has haunted true crime the way no other unsolved case does. Not because the body count was the highest. It wasn't. Not because the crimes were the most brutal. They weren't, not by a long shot. It haunts us because the man responsible looked directly at the camera of American culture, waved and walked away laughing. He wrote to newspapers. He mocked detectives by name. He sent codes he dared the country to break, and some of those codes sat unsolved. For over 50 years, cracked only recently by strangers on the internet working for free in their spare time because the professionals had given up. He called himself Zodiac, and for half a century, the official answer to who was he has been the same 3 words: we don't know. But that sentence, the one that has closed every documentary and ended every article since 1969, might not be the ending anymore. Because in the last few years, 2 separate teams working from 2 separate angles have each stood up and said the same. Extraordinary thing, we found him. And here's the part that should make you lean in. They didn't find the same guy. Sit with that for a second, because it is the whole engine of this story. This is not a case where new evidence finally confirmed the old suspect everyone already assumed was guilty. If it were, this would be a shorter, duller video. This is a case where the man most people have spent decades assuming was Zodiac, the guy from the books, the guy from the movie, the guy whose face you'd probably picture right now if I asked you to imagine him, may never have been Zodiac at all. And the people now claiming to have the real answer are pointing somewhere else entirely, somewhere nobody was looking. That is the story here. Not one dramatic reveal, but a quiet, uncomfortable question underneath all of it. What happens when the science and the sleuthing finally start converging on somebody, and it isn't the guy the whole culture already convicted in its head? Let's set the scene properly, because the crimes themselves get lost under all the myth. Between December 1968 and October 1969, in the towns and hills surrounding San Francisco, a masked or hidden attacker killed at least 5 people and wounded 2 more who survived to describe him. He targeted young couples parked in quiet spots, and once, a cab driver in the middle of the city. He shot. He stabbed. And then, almost immediately after his first confirmed attacks, he began writing letters. Typed and handwritten, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle and other papers, signed with a circle crossed by a line, a symbol that looked like a gun sight and became, whether he intended it or not, one of the most recognizable icons in American crime history. He called himself Zodiac in those letters, and he included something no other serial killer of that era had ever handed police on a silver platter: ciphers. Coded messages he claimed would reveal his identity if solved, taunting the police and the public in the same breath to go ahead and try. One of those first ciphers, a 408 symbol puzzle, was cracked within a week by a schoolteacher and his wife working at their kitchen table, faster than the FBI or the NSA managed it. It described, chillingly, a killer who said he hunted humans because they were the most dangerous animal of all, and who claimed his victims would become his slaves in the afterlife. That single week, an ordinary couple outpacing federal codebreakers with nothing but pencil and paper set the tone for everything that followed. This was never going to be a case cracked quietly from inside an agency. It was going to be picked apart, piece by piece, by outsiders who refused to let it go. But a second, shorter cipher, just 340 characters, sat completely unbroken for 51 years. Cryptographers tried. Amateurs tried. Retired codebreakers took a run at it in their spare time and walked away defeated. The case went cold, then colder, then nearly forgotten by anyone outside true crime circles, filed away as one of those puzzles that simply outlives everyone who ever tries to solve it. And then, in December 2020, a team of 3 volunteers scattered across 3 different countries: a Belgian programmer, an Australian mathematician, and an American software developer who had never met in person and had been trading theories online for months, finally broke it. The message inside, once decoded, was almost anticlimactic, and all the more disturbing for it. No name, no confession. Just the ramblings of a man taunting the reader, telling them he wasn't afraid of the gas chamber because it would only send him to paradise faster. 51 years of silence, and the payoff was a killer still laughing from beyond the page. No name. That's the sentence that has defined this entire case. Every lead, every confession letter, every cipher, every taunt. And never once, not in 55 years, has Zodiac's actual identity been confirmed, which is exactly the vacuum that suspects rush in to fill. And for most of the modern era of this case, one man's face has filled that vacuum more than anyone else's. His name was Arthur Leigh Allen, a former elementary school teacher who was already known to police before Zodiac ever wrote his first letter. Allen had a criminal record for child molestation. He owned a handgun matching the type used in one of the attacks. A former coworker told police Allen had once made comments about wanting to shoot young couples and call himself Zodiac before the letters had even gone public, comments that, if the timeline is accurate, are almost impossible to explain away as coincidence. Investigators searched his home. They interviewed him twice. A true crime author built an entire best-selling career, and eventually a Hollywood film, around the theory that Allen was their man. And for a generation of true crime fans, that film became the de facto ending to a story that never actually ended. In the movie, and in the popular imagination that followed it, Arthur Leigh Allen is the Zodiac Killer. Case closed, roll credits. Except it wasn't closed, because when DNA testing became sophisticated enough to actually be useful, investigators pulled saliva from the back of the stamps Zodiac had licked and sealed onto his letters decades earlier. It was a real physical, biological trace of the actual killer, sitting there waiting. And when they compared it against Arthur Leigh Allen's DNA, it didn't match. Not partially, not ambiguously, it excluded him. The man whose face had been printed across true crime books and streaming. Documentaries for 20 years, the man millions of people were confident was Zodiac, was formally ruled out by his own genetic material. Allen died in 1992, still publicly denying it, and the DNA exclusion came years after his death, which means he never got to see his name cleared, and the public never quite got the memo either. A 2024 docuseries revisited his story in exhaustive detail, interviewing people who grew up around him and who remain convinced to this day that police had it right the first time, regardless of what the DNA says. Some of them describe him as a man who all but confessed to them privately, decades before his death. In offhand comments, they say they didn't fully understand the weight of until much later. Others who knew him describe someone awkward and unsettling, but insist the physical evidence has to win in the end, that a lifetime of bad vibes isn't the same thing as guilt. That disagreement alone tells you something about how emotionally loaded this case still is, more than half a century later. People do not want to let go of an ending, even a wrong one, because the alternative is admitting we're back to nothing. So if it isn't Allen, who is it? This is where the story splits, and where you have to hold two very different investigations in your head at once, because they lead to two completely different men, and neither has been confirmed by the police departments that actually hold the case files. The first came from a group calling themselves the Case Breakers, a team of retired law enforcement officers, forensic specialists, and journalists who spent roughly a decade combing through the case from the ground up. In 2021, they announced they had identified their suspect, a man named Gary Francis Poste, a house painter and former altar boy who died in 2018, more than 2 decades before anyone accused him publicly. Poste was never convicted of anything related to Zodiac. He was never even publicly named as a suspect while he was alive. But the case breakers laid out a stack of circumstantial evidence they say ties him not only to the Bay Area killings, but to an earlier, similarly brutal murder of a young woman named Cherie Jo Bates in Riverside in 1966, a killing many investigators have long suspected was Zodiac's actual first crime, years before he ever adopted the name. Eyewitness accounts, they claimed, placed a man matching Poste near multiple crime scenes. They pointed to details in his personal history, his access to certain equipment, his general physical resemblance to police sketches, and pieced together what they called, in their own words, an evidentiary goldmine. It made national headlines. Photographs of Poste as a younger man were placed side by side with the famous police composite sketch. And to a lot of viewers online, the resemblance looked uncanny, close enough to reignite the whole case overnight. The team said they'd gathered more than 20 eyewitnesses and sources willing to speak on the record, along with what they described. As a personal cache of Poste's own belongings recovered from his old property, items they claimed included photographic equipment and writings they believed matched the killer's known habits. It made national headlines. It also, notably, made 0 official police departments budge. The agencies with jurisdiction over the actual murders declined to confirm the identification, and some pushed back on it entirely, stating plainly that the case remained open and that no suspect had been officially cleared to that level of certainty, which is a pattern you'll want to remember because it repeats. Then, just as that theory had settled into being one more name on a long list, a second and completely unrelated claim surfaced. And this one didn't just point somewhere new, it tried to connect Zodiac to an entirely different unsolved American nightmare. An amateur codebreaker, working independently and reportedly, spending years cross-referencing ciphers, letters, and court records, announced that he believed he had not only identified Zodiac, but linked him to the infamous 1947 murder of Elizabeth Short, the case the tabloids of the era immortalized as the Black Dahlia killing, one of the most notorious unsolved murders in American history, committed more than 20 years before Zodiac's first confirmed attack. The name attached to this theory is Marvin Margolis, a former pre-med student and World War II Navy corpsman. If true, and that word is doing enormous work in that sentence, it would mean one man carried out 2 of the most famous unsolved murder mysteries in the country across 2 different decades in 2 very different cities, and somehow was never definitively caught for either. It is an audacious claim, It rests heavily on Cipher analysis, on the idea that hidden patterns inside Zodiac's own coded letters, once mapped correctly, spell out connections to Short's murder that no one had previously thought to look for, along with circumstantial biographical overlaps between where Margolis lived, trained, and worked, and where both sets of crimes took place. It is also, as of right now, just that, a claim, reported and examined by serious journalists, but unconfirmed by forensic testing and unconfirmed by the police departments, who would need to sign off on it before anyone could responsibly call this case closed. And that's really the shape of where things stand today. Not one confirmed answer, but two rival unofficial answers, arriving from two different directions, built by two different teams, who owe each other nothing and have no reason to coordinate a story between them, and neither one matching the guy the culture already decided was guilty back in the 1990s. If you're used to true crime stories with a tidy bow at the end, this is the part where it gets uncomfortable, because there isn't one. What there is, instead, is a pattern worth paying attention to, the same pattern that shows up in almost every cold case that eventually gets closer to a real answer. Confident theories collapse under DNA. Circumstantial cases get built, get headlines, and then stall at the desk of the agency that actually has the authority to confirm or deny them. And the public, understandably, keeps wanting an ending badly enough that half-built theories get treated like verdicts long before they've earned it. So why hasn't official law enforcement simply run the DNA against Poste, or Margolis, or anyone else, and settled this for good? Partly, it's the age of the evidence itself, decades-old genetic material that has degraded and been tested and retested with the limited technology available at each stage, sometimes producing partial or contaminated profiles that can exclude a suspect with confidence, but can't always confirm one with the same certainty. Partly, it's jurisdiction, because Zodiac's confirmed killings crossed multiple counties, meaning multiple police departments each hold pieces of the file, and getting them to align on a single official. Conclusion has historically been its own bureaucratic nightmare, and partly uncomfortably, its institutional caution. A police department publicly naming a dead man as one of the most notorious killers in American history, without an unbreakable case, opens the door to real consequences, defamation concerns for surviving family members, and the professional risk of being wrong in front of the entire country the way the Allen theory eventually was. Skepticism from the agencies holding the actual case files isn't necessarily obstruction. Sometimes it's just what caution looks like when the cost of being wrong is somebody's name attached to 5 murders forever. Which brings us back to that stamp. That one tiny fleck of physical, provable biology, sitting in an evidence file for decades before anyone had the tools to read it, and then quietly ending the career of the internet's favorite suspect the moment they did. It is worth remembering that detail every time a new name gets floated, because it is the single hardest piece of evidence in this entire case, and it is the bar every future suspect eventually has to clear. Circumstantial evidence can build a compelling story. Eyewitness memory, decades old, can be sincere and still be wrong. Coded messages can be interpreted to fit almost any theory, if you want them to badly enough. But DNA doesn't care how good your story is. If genetic material from Poste or Margolis or anyone else the amateur investigators name next is ever tested against that stamp and it matches, this case is over. Immediately, permanently, no debate. And if it doesn't match, we're back exactly where we've been since 1969. Watching new names arrive, watching them dazzle headlines for a news cycle, and watching them quietly fail to clear the one test that actually matters. So here's where that leaves us, 55 years out from the first attack, and 51 years out from the last confirmed letter. The man millions of people spent 2 decades believing was Zodiac has been scientifically excluded. 2 competing modern investigations have each proposed a different replacement built from different evidence, pointing at different men, neither confirmed. And the actual authorities who hold the keys to ending this for good have, so far, said nothing that resembles a final answer. Somewhere in an evidence locker, that stamp still exists, that DNA still exists, and theoretically, at any point, a new comparison could either make one of these names permanent or erase it exactly the way it erased Arthur Leigh Allen's. Until that happens, everything you've just heard, the house painter, the corpsman, the decades of circumstantial threads pulling toward a name, is a theory competing with other theories, not a verdict. Which is what makes this case different from almost every other one people put in true crime videos. It isn't a story about a killer who was finally caught. It's a story about how badly a culture wants an ending, and how easily that hunger turns an unproven name into a settled fact in the public imagination over and over again for 55 years running. So tell me, honestly, which of the theories you just heard actually convinced you, and which one still leaves you doubting? Because unlike almost everything else in this case, that answer is still genuinely up for grabs.